Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy and today we're looking at plots from the good guy's perspective. So much of this channel has been focused around the bad guys wanting something badly and having difficulty getting it. And frequently there are questions asked as to what happens if we turn that on the head? What happens if it's the good guys who want something desperately and are having difficulty getting it? How do we play that out? And certainly for a lot of people that seems to sit better than the idea of plotting out the villain's story. Now, whilst I might advocate the villain's story as being our center point, the only reason why I do that is because it's easier to get PCs to buy into the idea of the adventure rather than having the PCs trying to come up with the adventure. Now, of course, this really does depend on the type of players that you have and the type of characters that they're going to be running. If they are the sort who like to come up with their own adventures, then absolutely this video is for you. If they are the kind who sit back and let you try to get them into the plot, then you really need to focus on the villain side. And I'll explain why as we go through this video. So now we're trying out some new graphics. As you can see, well, they're not new graphics, but the idea is that I can now control them from my keyboard here as we're talking through. And I'd love your feedback on this particular subject. Now, let's look at this very first one, motivation. Now, motivation is the most important part of, and it's just paused, most important part, forgive me here, most important part of the buy-in from the players. Motivation comes in my opinion anyway, there's 4 different ways you can motivate players to go on this journey. Now, this is where having the villain or the henchman or the nemesis, this is where having the bad guy having a plot and driving it makes it so much easier for you. When it's the good guys, the motivation becomes difficult. If your motivation for go forth and accomplish this is an order, so in other words, the players' characters are part of a structured organization, maybe they're in Starfleet, maybe they're Jedi and they're responding to the council, perhaps they are police investigators and this is just another homicide they have to go and deal with. However they happen to be involved, if a power or an authority can give them orders to go and do something, that is motivation enough to get the players to want to go and do something. And frequently this is where we can use the good guy plot. So the head detective wants to investigate the crime lord. Off they send the players to go and do that. Now, the crime lord has nothing to do with this whatsoever. They're completely passive. The players are going out and the players are investigating. So the story then focuses around the players' investigations that lead them to the crime lord, rather than the crime lord doing something that involves and incorporates the player characters because of an accidental incursion, etc., etc. So orders are fine, but the players have to buy into those orders and then they have to follow them. It's very important that the players follow the orders. And this is something that can frequently go wrong. And I know this as a player, having played in now a Warhammer campaign on the Taking 20 YouTube channel with Cody. That was a lot of fun. But even there, I was following orders. And in doing so, my orders came into conflict with the reasoning of the entire world, if you like. So it became an interesting challenge. Thankfully, we worked through it and we had an absolutely great time. If your players, though, do not follow the orders, if they rebel against them, if they go up against them, you run the real risk of your entire adventure collapsing. If the players just abandon it, well, then there's no point in continuing. And because the motivation has come from the good side, the bad plot carries on, the bad guy does whatever it is that they need to do, the evil sorceress takes over the planet, etc., etc., because the players' characters just weren't involved. The same kind of thing happens when we then turn to rewards as a motivating factor. So if the players are promised, I will give you 1,000 gold pieces per undead that you bring back to me to destroy, or whatever the idea is, the reward of this for that is very powerful, except when the tough gets tougher. So you're going to make the adventure challenging, you're going to make the players' characters have to work for their reward, but again, as with orders, if the player characters go, you know what, this is not worth it, whatever it is that we're getting is worth more if we sell it than if we give it to the person for what they're giving us. Or we're going to die over this. This isn't worth getting. This really isn't worth getting. So again, they can withdraw from the situation, in which case then you're left with little recourse but to call the adventure to close. It's difficult to bring players back onto an adventure if they've abandoned it. That's something that you really don't want to do. That phrase, flogging a dead horse, you really don't want to try and force characters back into a plot that they've gone, we're done. So that's something to bear in mind. Making it personal. Now, this is why I like focusing on the bad guys, on the villains, and having their adventure overlap and incorporate the player characters. When the villains do something personal against the player characters, that's all the motivation we need. Players will want to go back and get their revenge on this individual who has caused them an injustice. So, if the plot comes from the player characters, if they decide this is a mission that they're going to go on, there's strong motivation to do that. To get the players to decide on which mission they want to go on can sometimes be like herding cats, absolutely, but you can do it. So if you really try and figure out how to manipulate the system to get the player characters to decide on the course of adventure, then that's fine. You do, of course, need to make sure that the adventure can move forward. And once the player character has been on that adventure, is there more for them to go on? Well, we'll look at that a little bit later, but absolutely the personalizing, making it personal, makes a lot more sense. If the player characters come across an orphan girl who dies in their arms and then they want to investigate that story, that's a fairly good starting point to work from. It makes it personal. Now, Railroad is another option that you can take, and you just force the characters to go on the adventure, whether they want to or not. This is obviously frowned upon in many circles because, well, railroading is seen as this big bad thing where the players no longer have any kind of free will or agency. They don't really have free will or agency anyway, because you're manipulating the system to tell a story in one shape, form or another, or you are so disengaged and disavowed from having any responsibility for the story that it doesn't really happen anyway. It just kind of devolves into a hack and slash type of situation. So railroading isn't as bad as it sounds necessarily. Sometimes you do just need to say, you start in front of the door that you're going to pick a lock on, and you're going to move through that and you're going to go from there. Modules are all railroad written because they have to be. If the players stop halfway through or if they change their minds, the module collapses. It's not designed to fit outside of those parameters. So they might have clever ways of trying to bring the party back to the module, but generally speaking, no one can anticipate all of the broad options that the players can come up with. So when we look at motivation, the critical thing is to make sure that we can maintain that motivation throughout the journey. So if we start with it as being an order, perhaps halfway through the adventure, we need to make sure that it becomes personal. We attack the PCs specifically, or we abduct an NPC that they've been liking. We try and work the different types of motivations together. If you see your players are starting to flag on motivations because the orders are a little bit lackluster, they don't really like their captain, the personal aspect, they don't really give a damn if the convict survives or dies, throw in a reward option. They realize that the villain has actually got this magic ring or something that they could then gain and claim control over. So you can try and figure out how to use these different motivations to keep the players invested in your adventure as they go along. Now, if we then look at how do villains change, if the villain is not the person who we have focused our adventure around, in other words, they're not the one who wants something badly, the villain is just going about their business, they're doing something. So perhaps you've gone, oh, the villains are trying to rob a bank. But that's not what my adventure is about. My adventure is about my players, characters, discovering that the villain is trying to rob the bank. The actual act of the villain is not completely important because it doesn't form those key components, those key cog areas that a traditional villain-based story would do. Traditional villain-based story, we need our villains to be constantly aware of what's happening. Our villains need to realize that, oh, the players are starting, or the player characters are starting to interfere with my plans. I need to go and stop them from doing that. Villains also need to be unchanging in this situation. Whilst our characters are on their journey to save the princess, the villain can't decide to go, oh, we're going to move the princess. Well, They could, I suppose, but that might feel very strange. It might feel very odd to the players who go, but the villain didn't know that we were coming, and now they're suddenly moving the princess? That doesn't make sense. Because you also haven't seeded it. So if it wasn't part of your original plan, you need to seed it. And you'll see we'll come up to that seeding point much, much later. But the idea that your villains are very interactive in this kind of plot is not going to happen. Your villains don't have grand plans that are beyond the scope of this. So, as an example, the captain of the ship says, go and investigate that planet. The characters beam down to the planet's surface and they discover a warlord who is trying to take over the planet by blackmailing the political leaders. The villain doesn't have a huge amount of planning going on. They've just got some blackmail on those leaders and they're trying to force their hand. The leaders are trying to resist, but they are slowly falling one by one. The player's character's journey is now how do they uncover this, how do they solve it, and how do they move forward. The villain is not really interactive. The villain is basically just a goal for them to get to at the end and to defeat. So the villain remains focused on their course of action. They don't change, they don't vary from what they had planned. They are there to act as the backdrop for the main story that the player characters are going through. And that story unfolds based on how the player characters react. I know it sounds similar to the bad plot direction, but again, we're working on the players driving this idea rather than on you as the GM guiding them because of events and things. Here, the players must dictate which direction they go. They are the good guys after all. So villains change a little bit. We don't have so much. The idea of the 1-to-1 or the 1-to-2 method is also dead. It can't work in this kind of situation. When the players are driving the narrative, when the good guys are driving the narrative, the introduction certainly is there, the middle is there, and the conclusion is there, but it's not as strong or as punctuated as it would be if we were plotting out for an evil campaign. In an evil campaign, we definitely have our introduction to the setting and the situations, we definitely have our discovery period, our near success, and then our total failure, and then we have our conclusion in a nutshell. In a good plot, we don't use that technique. We use a different technique, or at least I propose that you use a different technique. And that technique is called yes, but, and no, and. Now, it's an old-fashioned technique, but the way that it works is our characters need to discover that the politicians are being blackmailed. They investigate one of the politicians who says, yes, we are being blackmailed, but you can't go to the lead villain because if you do, he will kill our children. So whenever you give a yes answer, you have to give a but answer. And you then alternate. So whenever you give a no answer, you need to have an and. No, our players don't discover that the politicians are being blackmailed by this evil villain, and they get arrested because they are being suspicious within the city grounds. So the yes, but, no, and scenario allows you to create this very fluid, very well planned out series of events that you can count on. If you say, right, in my adventure, we've got this villain who's blackmailing people, and our characters are going to try and solve it. They're going to be ordered to try and solve it. So when they arrive at the planet, do they arrive at the planet? Yes, but they find that the planet is under siege, or they find that the planet has radio silence. What are they going to do? If they land on the planet, yes, they land on the planet, but they discover the planet is currently underwater, or is currently being in the middle of a tsunami, or a hurricane, or a typhoon, or whatever. No, they don't land on the planet, and instead they land on a moon. Or no, they don't land on a planet, and they get boarded by pirates. So it allows you to just run these scenarios of ever-increasing catastrophe. So in other words, the adventure is hinged around this yes, but, no, and kind of scenario. So what you need to do is, instead of planning out how the villain is going to be doing all of their little minutiae and how they're going to adapt their plan, is you are throwing this sentence in there, and then you're using your planned space, your planned information, to fulfill that requirement. So you might have city guards statted out, you might have the bad guy statted out, you might have some maps, you might have some traps and encounters and things, and now you just slowly start to pull from them as you go, yes, but, no, and. The players discover a thumbprint. Yes, they do. But the thumbprint belongs to one of them. The players do not discover a thumbprint, and they completely miss the data entry. However you want to do it. But this idea is that it escalates and it pushes not the story forward. Because remember, with the good guy plot, generally speaking, it's more nebulous. It's not so specific as with the villain plot. The good guy plot is go and stop people. Go and stop this from happening. Go and save the day. Go and do this. Go and do that. So how do they save the day? How do they explore that? That's up to the players to decide. That's up to them to drive that idea forward. Yes, but, no, and comes in really, really handy. There's a challenge, though, with the yes, but, no, and issue. And that challenge is causality. We need to make sure that when we are creating these yes, but, and no, and scenarios, is that they have a sense of continuity, that they have a sense that they're part of what we're talking about, and that there's context to them. So, yes, you arrive on the planet, but you are arrested because the big bad has decided that he wants to impersonate you and cause you to have a bad reputation. Do you get persecuted for it? No, and you get exonerated. Or do you get persecuted for it? Yes, but the persecuting authority realizes that you are not, in actual fact, the bad guys. There is an imposter. So they secretly work with you from the prison, whereas you're now in the prison and now you're going to go as undercover prison agents to try and infiltrate the big bad. However that happens to work out. So the links, the causality of the yes, but, the no, and, they need to link together. They need to make some kind of sense. You arrive at the planet, yes, but the planet has turned into candy floss. Unless the entire adventure is set on some trippy, weird, sci-fi-esque delusion, or there is something in the air filters that's causing them to see this kind of stuff, it needs to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then your players are going to get very, very easily and very quickly uninterested and totally out of their depth. They won't know what to do because there's no sense to it. It just goes crazy. Talking of crazy, you have to avoid going too crazy. You arrive, yes, but the planet is in a nuclear holocaust. Yes, you have equipment on board and you go down to the planet's surface and you start wandering around. No, you can't open up the atomic bunker and you're now attacked by 800-foot tall Godzilla-type monsters. That's still kind of okay. Again, though, you can start to spin out of control and make it feel as if it's one catastrophe after the next. That's something that you have to avoid. And I'm going to come to that just a little bit, I hope. Doing these things live is awfully nerve-wracking. Anyway, the idea is that this is a very plottable kind of idea. So, a plottable approach. Your villain's plan is to dominate the planet, and they've got these spies everywhere, and they use this, that, and the next thing. So, that's fine. The villain doesn't have any obstacles. They're not having difficulty getting what they want. It's just starting to happen. And this is how they're doing it. Your players have arrived, and there's a yes, but, no, and scenario playing out. So you can quite easily chart out that binary yes, but, no, and type of scenario. It's not difficult. Do they arrive at the planet? Yes, but what happens? Do they arrive at the planet? No, and the space shuttle is re-diverted to another moon. Do they arrive at the other moon? Yes, but, and so on and so forth. So you can end up with this long string. It's a very different way of plotting out your adventure rather than the 3-act structure, the 1-2-1 method. There is no limit, by the way, to how many branches you can have in terms of your plan. It just goes in whichever direction it wants to, following this yes, but, no, and scenario. Now, you can use this type of adventure, obviously, when the player's characters come up with, oh, I want to go and investigate my history, or I want to go and do this, or I want to go and do that. So it's easy to plan because you just run through these binary scenarios. Do they do this or do they do that? You're not railroading them into those choices. You're just opening up what happens when they get to here, what happens when they get to there. It's a very fluid way of creating a story, or a plot anyway. It can be difficult to control, though, because yes, but, no, and has to be applied consistently. So that means bringing it back to the main plot line, to the main storyline, can be tricky, because you've got to use yes, but to get there, and you've got to make sure that the player's characters are doing things that cause you to get there, or you have to bend the main story back again. Again, because we haven't necessarily focused on the villains' goals and their objectives and things, it can become problematic to try and bend it to fitting where the characters happen to be in that entire process. Now, the rewards of this entire process is that it's a very organic process, it's a very fluid space, it's a very unpredictable plot. There is no ways to know where this is going because it's a constant growth of yes, but, no, and. It must end, and you must punctuate it with endings. Do they stop the warlord? Yes. But they discover he had outside sources. Fin. End. Done. That's where the adventure ends. Let the players relax. Let the characters receive their just rewards that they were promised, whether the order is now fulfilled or whether they get their financial reward or whatever one of those rewards you chose. It must be given to them. You can't just continue this cascading effect of yes, but, no, and. So you must decide, when do you get to the end point? When is it over? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it isn't. Don't continue to push it. Sometimes you have to remember, or you have to realize that yes, but is a yes, but, and done. Done. So you need to know where you end. Now, you can also obviously seed. You must seed the whole way through, throwing out all sorts of random bits and pieces, because that last but that's going to lead you to another adventure. If you've got lots of seeds out there, that but becomes open-ended, and again, it allows the player character's agency to choose which direction they're going in. Where do they want to go next? Well, they've got all these different seed options to think about. So yes, but they discover the warlord has help off of planet. Sure. If they want to, they can go and investigate that. If they don't want to, they can go in another direction. You as the GM haven't wasted any time working out this larger scale campaign plan with all these intricate villains connected to one another. The players can go where they want to. So I suppose in this way, the yes, but, no, and is a lot more open to player exploration than perhaps the 1-2-1, which is much more structured and which requires certain things to happen and for you to manipulate the situation. Both require manipulation from your point of view as the GM. You have to guide them in certain ways, or not, depending on your style. But in my style, you guide them to get to a certain point. Here, you're not entirely sure where that point is, so it's easier to guide them, I suppose, because you're all trying to discover it at the same time. So that is my take on good guy plots, where the characters or a higher power gives a mission, gives an adventure to good characters who then go out and start to explore that space. They start to understand and unpack just what all of that means and how and where they can solve it and find out information. It is a very easy type of adventure to design initially. It can run away from you if you don't control it, if you don't bring it back. You need to have a good idea and understanding of the space in which your player characters are operating so that you can logically follow it through. If you've got a world map, as mine is over there on the wall, you need to know that world map so that if they go off course, the yes, but, no, and scenarios can still apply. It must be contextual, it must be relevant, it must be based on what's happening, and it should be based on what the characters are expecting, based on what you've seeded. So you've got all of the ramifications of the 1-to-1 method and of the evil plotting process, but without necessarily the same direction and force of will of the villain driving it as you would have normally. It's an interesting approach to take, and I have to admit, although I usually present polar opposites or specifically individual ideas, a blending of this method, the yes, but, no, and, as well as the one-to-one method, ultimately, I think, will lead to the most interesting type of adventure that you can have. One where you're not entirely sure of all the minutiae because you're exploring it as much as the player characters are exploring it, but where you have a good sense of the outcome, you have a good sense of how things will change if the characters interact and do certain things. That for me is the perfect balance, and I must admit, in my own games, that's what I use, is a bit of a balance between the two. Those are my thoughts in 26,000 minutes. I'm sorry it took so long. These slowed me down. So let me know what you think about these text boxes. We've had votes on the channel before where people said, well, they didn't really mind if they were there or if they weren't there. Let me know what you think. Is it too invasive? Obviously, the more I do it, the easier it'll become for me to use the down arrow keys and all that kind of stuff, as well as do these things add value to you? Do you find them adding value? Let me know. Also, let me know your thoughts on the good guy plot. I know it's a little bit nebulous. It's not as concise as I would like it to be. But that's the way that yes, but, no, and works, is that there is no hard and fast formula. You don't run it 12 times and then give them the solution. It just runs until you decide it's over. That's that particular style of the game. And it's something that you can learn to adapt and include, and it will certainly improve all of your games. Until next time, head on over to www.worldanvil.com where you can set up your worlds so that these kinds of plotting mechanisms will be easy for you. You know exactly what's going on because it's all in World Anvil where your entire campaign is based. And there's some amazing features that are there. There's even more features that are coming up. It's in a very, very exciting space. Well, they are our partners in crime in terms of they do the admin and we do other stuff like having fun. And yes, have a look if you haven't already. Until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of gaming.